I'm really going to try and rattle through making the case for basic income in the way that I suppose is personal to me, and that will probably take. Hopefully, my goal is to do it in about 15 minutes and leave plenty of time for Anna and then for questions. I think one of the interesting things about basic income as we dive into this is that there are lots of people who support the idea of basic income from very different kind of political and economic positions. So I'm not going to try and, I mean, there's one way of approaching this, which is to say, oh, well, you can, there's this reason to support it, and there's this reason, and there's this perspective. I'm going to more focus on the way that I think we should think about things, if you like. So my basic argument in a nutshell is that there are many things people need to live a good life, and that economic security is one of those things, and it's essential to our well-being, and that basic income is the best solution for providing this security. But basic income is only one part of a just welfare state, and that the welfare state is itself only one part of a just society. And I'm going to end with some reflections on basic income and the UBI Lab network, because I suppose one of my beliefs is that focusing on basic income and using the kind of strategies that we've been using through UBI Lab network is turning out to be the most effective anti-poverty campaign around. So this is probably a thought that's been expressed in many different ways over the years, but it is that, you know, the great sin of economics is that we can value what we can, that we value what we count instead of what really counts. And from my perspective, many of the things that really matter in life aren't actually captured by the kind of things that are typically focused on in ordinary economics, if you like, the kind of GDP, monetary exchange economics that we're so used to. I come from a tradition which says that actually what we've got to think about is how people flourish as human beings. What are the conditions for that flourishing? It's kind of Aristotelian tradition, which thinks about citizenship as our central way of living a good life. And that what's really important to our well-being are resources, but also opportunities and relationships and some other things as well. And that the conditions for collective well-being really flow from our collective commitment to justice. So in other words, what makes life good is living a good life, but what makes it easier to live a good life is the way we choose to organize things to make that possible, which is justice. And money fits into this picture in the sense that money doesn't ensure a good life, but poverty does ensure a hard life. So my perspective is that money is in the modern world, money is an important and essential element of living a good life, although it doesn't make for a good life on its own. And I can't quite see my own slides here because of the way the screen puts up, but I was really struck, I wanted to make a point about economic security, because a lot of the time the debates around economics and income and earnings and work tend to focus on money and earnings and income as a flow, but don't tend to think about actually the conditions of security, what makes people feel connected, rooted, secure in their position. And there's a lot of, and I came across this in my little personal library of quotes, and I just thought it was really interesting to listen to Nelson Mandela, who was one of the supporters of basic income, talk about this back in 1978. He wasn't specifically talking about basic income, but he was talking about what his hopes were for and what the hopes of ordinary Africans were for escaping the downside, the many negatives of the apartheid era. And it just seemed to me really powerful, this, you know, he's talking about the way in which the organization of life in South Africa is robbing people of security, is robbing people of rights, is forcing people from move to pillar from post, not enabling people to establish themselves in a way that allows for their dignity or ability to live a flourishing life. And I must admit, I was struck because in the work at the Centre for Welfare Reform, we've been very focused on the very negative things going on in the current welfare system. And many of the things that are called welfare reforms to our eyes look like damage, look like the destruction of the welfare state. You know, it seems to me absolutely shameful that London boroughs send people to the north of England because they're deemed homeless. They send their own citizens to the north of England. I mean, part of me thinks, well, you're getting a good deal here, but really it's just, I mean, what a state for our society that that's going on. What a state that northerners feel forced to go down south to get work. What a state it is that if you volunteer, you can be sanctioned for volunteering rather than looking for work. Single mothers sent to prison for not telling the DWP that they're in a relationship. What a kind of society does that? The kind of chronic indebtedness, homelessness, job insecurity that's driving poor mental health and suicide. And now we see these kind of other attacks on voting and exclusion for democratic action that we're talking about at the moment. So we're living in a very dark era ourselves. Of course, not apartheid era South Africa, but there's some telling kind of similarities here about the economic conditions that have been worsening for ordinary people in the United Kingdom. So where does basic income come in? Well, basic income is the proposition, I think, and this is, I mean, there are varying definitions and there is a standard basic income Earth Network definition. This is my slightly Simon-esque definition, but it starts with the assumption that a decent community commits to ensure everybody gets enough money to live on as a human right. And the most efficient and effective way of doing that is to just give every single person enough money to live on. And so you achieve the condition of sufficiency. Universality also means that you get that money whether you're in a family or whether you're not in a family, and you strip out of the system kind of dependency. You also strip out conditionality by saying you get it whatever lifestyle you choose. So we're not going to find out how many times you wrote a CV this week or how many jobs you applied for. You just get it because you're a human being and you're a citizen. And you get it whatever your income. So you get it if you're poor, if you're moderate income, or if you're rich, you get the same basic income. And you pay for it by paying taxes. And there is a whole complex and multivarious perspectives on what taxes and how taxes, but I'm quite happy with looking at it through the lens of income and seeing this as a redistribution of income. So income tax seems to me quite natural. And also I would argue that you also need to give some more income to people with extra needs. So I and colleagues have advocated the case for UBI plus, but I'm not going to be talking about that today unless the conversation gets us that way. Now, the biggest threat, I don't know if anybody in Café Économique believes this, but the tendency, particularly from the right, is to say, well, this will just make people lazy. And this is a kind of easy argument to disprove in a way. I mean, the first thing that UBI does is it improves the incentive to work by reducing the taxes that people pay on low incomes to kind of normal rates of taxation. Whereas at the moment, the benefit system effectively supercharges the marginal rate of tax that people pay by expecting people to pay very high part of the extra earnings they make back to the state at the level of 60, 70, 80, 90, sometimes over 100%. UBI is associated with significant improvements in mental health, IQ, educational attainment, many other benefits that we associate with actually helping people live positive and productive lives. And we see that, in fact, people continue to see, in the pilots we've seen, people continue to seek paid work, or sometimes they go on to learn new skills, which seems like actually a very good thing for the economy. And we know from our own experience, I don't know in your lives, but we see that rich people carry on working, even though they don't need to work. And pensioners often choose to carry on working, even though they don't need to work. So this assumption that people will only work if they need to work seems to be disproved almost everywhere you look. But what we start to do is we take away this fear that people have that they will lose their income if they start trying to work or if they volunteer. For many disabled people, the way the benefit system works often actually can make it harder to do little bits of work or to just try work out or to do productive volunteering. And of course, UBI doesn't stop us doing all the other things that help people find productive uses for their time and energy and gifts, like education and training and mutual support. In fact, it makes it easier to do those things because we're actually released from some of the controls over us. What it does do is it removes sanctions, it creates economic security, and it reduces stigma and poverty. Why is the other big question that people ask is it affordable? And again, there is a complex debate around this in a way, because depending on your assumptions about what level applies, and there are lots of assumptions that people make as, oh, well, we can't possibly afford it because we've got into this mindset, which is that, well, you know, nobody's willing to pay any extra taxes. So of course we can't afford it, which is a bit kind of backwards, isn't it? I mean, if something's really good, and if lots of people benefit from it, maybe we'll be happy to pay some increased taxes. But the thing about the organization of basic income, it sounds quite an expensive thing, but actually it's not really an expensive thing, because actually it's just a form of redistribution. So the question becomes, what's the net cost of basic income, and who are the beneficiaries? And if you just use income tax to redistribute a basic income, what you effectively do is redistribute incomes around the mean income. And given that incomes are very unequally distributed as it stands, what you tend to do is redistribute incomes so that about 85% of people are better off and about 15% of people who are richer are worse off, which seems like a good thing to me. I'm going to skip through some of these slides which underline how realistic this is, just to save some time. And we also have lots of evidence about the benefits of basic income, which are so many and so multiple. And again, we could come back to some of these things, but it's almost like look at any variable and basic income seems to make things better. It is important to underline this point around what I would describe as the shift from a kind of patriarchal system to an egalitarian system. The current system really does rely very heavily on this notion of somebody. Anyway, sorry, I'll plow on. The current system really assumes that there are people who are earners, and then there are people who are dependents of those earners. And I think the most radical thing that basic income does is say, no, every single individual has a right in their own person to receive a sufficient level of income. And if people then choose to live in family forms, then that's great. So and that's why many feminists support basic income too. So I think that one of the things about basic income is really it's a challenge to an assumption which has become natural, that the only way of living these days is to kind of assume that we must have high degrees of insecurity, that we must all feel like our lives could be turned over on tuppence, that we need risk, we need not to feel safe. But this is very unnatural. This is not how human beings have typically lived. It's this process of capitalist economic development over the last 150 years or more that has left us in this kind of denuded state. And so basic income is really an attempt to actually go back to the concept of everybody having enough and having security that they will have enough. Just some final thoughts here about positioning basic income. So basic income isn't the answer to everything, and it's not the only thing that needs to be in place in a welfare state. So this is how I imagine a just welfare state. It would have at least five kind of pillars of key provision. And so income is really being met through basic income. Healthcare is not going to be met through an equivalent through cash transfers, although it is, but through cash transfers to doctors and to nurses and to other health professions. And there are reasons why healthcare is better delivered in that system, just as there are reasons why income security is better delivered through basic income. I think there's arguments about what's the right form of housing security. I would argue that land value tax and a right for everybody to own their homes could be combined into a different form of housing security. But there are the debates to be had about that, because housing is itself a distinct public good with its distinct logic. Support services also tend to be things that actually people need to control. So it's very important that if I'm getting support because I have a disability, that I control and shape that support around my needs. I shouldn't be forced to live in an institution or a care home because that's more convenient to the government to organize things like that. These things have to support me in my citizenship. Education also has its own logic. So when we think about the welfare state, we need to recognize that the different things we need to flourish as human beings need to be organized in different ways, depending on the kind of thing they are. And so my argument for basic income in this context is that for the kind of things that income delivers, then basic income is the best form of delivery of that. The other thing that I think is really important to recognize is that the welfare state has historically been highly committed not to income or redistribution, but to the development of services. In fact, you could argue that some of the first forms of the welfare state were very negative things, like the workhouse. You know, actually saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to provide this building. We have one just up the road in Sheffield, which was the Nether Edge Hospital, which was the institution where poor people, disabled people were put. They had no control over that. That's a service, not pretty close to a prison, really, where people were placed. So institutional provision and services is often the kind of things that systems of power do. They create things that are convenient to the middle class elites who run them, and they exercise power over people through those services. It's not the best way of organizing every kind of help we need, and we need to think about the different kinds of things, and we need to try and think about how we solve more problems upstream. At the end of last year, I was writing a report about the work of a peer support group in Doncaster, which is providing crisis support to people who are feeling suicidal. You look at the factors that drive people to suicide, it's not the lack of a mental health service, it's lack of money, it's the benefit system, it's loss of job, it's indebtedness. These are upstream problems. The mental health service is a downstream solution. And we need to be thinking about what we do to avoid people ever needing to come anywhere near a mental health service. And there are many other examples of these kind of upstream solutions, which are often really about redistributions of not just money, but also power. And for us, we think that actually the welfare state itself needs to be really situated within an effective democracy. So if we really think about the kinds of changes we need, then again, for me, universal basic income is a reorganization of resources at the level of social and economic justice. But it isn't the only thing that makes a difference to a good life. There are lots of other things we need to pay attention to. And in a democracy, in a mature democracy, which of course we do not live in, then you would have a constitution that distributed powers at many different levels, and people would be able to be citizens in their neighborhoods and in their regions, as also nationally. Just last thought, you know, the UBI Lab Network, I think I can be corrected by Johnny, who may be on the call, but last count I had was we had 44 labs working very effectively, not just in the UK, but also I think the latest one was in Buenos Aires. What's going on here is that people are excited by the idea of basic income, and they're willing to act to make it happen. They're willing to put pressure on governments, on politicians, on the system to make it happen. And that's why I think that the basic income work is one of the most exciting things going on at the moment. People saw just today, we had the Senedd in Wales committee challenging the Welsh government that their pilot for basic income, planned pilot, wasn't radical enough. Of course, we're nowhere near that in England with the Conservative majority that we have, but now we've got in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland significant leadership for basic income, and we have support from Andy Burnham and many, many other political leaders for basic income. So we've actually turned a really important corner politically on this issue. This is not a pipe dream. This is coming, I think. So, I mean, these are the political parties that say they support either testing or implementing it. So what's missing is obviously the Conservative Party and the current leadership of the Labour Party have got very cold feet now. I'm not going to avoid debating that, but almost everybody else, including all the political parties in Northern Ireland, which seems extraordinary, are for at least piloting basic income. That's my talk, Janie, Malcolm. Yeah.
Do you want to stop sharing?
Yeah. If I can remember how to do that, excuse me.
I think there's a little sign at the top usually.
Yeah. So my cursor disappears, that's the problem. Let me try. Maybe can you unshare me? I think I've managed to press the wrong button and now I don't have a good cursor unless I'm very clever. Oh, there we go.
That's great.
Right.
Very much indeed, Simon. Well, we won't have questions at this point, although I see people have started to put them into the chat already. So let me now ask Anna to do her presentation. Anna, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I will share my screen. And
I just wonder, I'll just make sure everybody has muted themselves before we start, because just to make sure. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Right. Here we go. Good. Now, I think that is, so I'm going to talk about the social guarantee, and I'm going to try to avoid having a direct argument about UBI, because I think this is the case I want to make. So I'm going to talk about the social guarantee, which is about universal access to life's essentials. And there are many points of shared points here between the philosophy behind what I'm saying and what Simon has been saying. And this is where oh, there we go. So our starting point is this idea of a safe and just space for humanity, which Kate Raworth has created through her wonderful donut economics. And we start with the understanding that we want to meet human needs within planetary boundaries. So everyone is entitled to life's essentials today and in the future. And we need a delivery system that is both universal and sufficient. And that we need to be able to tackle inequalities in a climate emergency. So if you look at that, the middle of that diagram, that's where we are. We're trying to keep people above the social foundation and below the ecological ceiling in what Raworth calls a safe and just space for humanity. We start there. This is the social guarantee. It's about pooling resources and working together so that we can all meet all of our needs. Now, whether you go to the academic literature or you have local conversations, what people need is the same here, the same everywhere, the same in this generation, in the last generation, the next generation. We have the same basic needs. Social guarantee is made up of two elements. One is a cash element, and that's comprised of a real living wage and a guaranteed minimum income. And the other side, which is the side we focus on, is the idea of universal services. And these are services and other collective measures. So it's not just about service provision, it is about a range of collective measures which will include service provision, but also things like regulation and investment of public funds. So there's a range of collective measures to make sure that everyone can have their basic needs met within planetary boundaries. And these are here on the slide, you'll see the services that we tend to focus on, but it's not a definitive list. So education, health and social care, housing, childcare, digital access, which has come to the fore recently, and also access to transport. But that's just what we focus on. It isn't a definitive list. So what do we mean by life's essentials? This is what every individual needs in order to survive and to participate in society and to flourish. And we have these same shared basic needs, which are health and critical autonomy. I mean, they've been expressed in different ways, but that's really at the basis of that. And these needs are universal across time and space, whoever you're talking to, whichever literature you're referring to. But how needs are met will vary very widely across locations and generations. But there are some, what we would call needs satisfiers or ways of satisfying needs that are constant. And these would include all the things that were on the previous slide, and then things like water and nutrition, as well as housing, education and healthcare. And that's where we focus. And so that's this kind of philosophical basis for the social guarantee. Now, I think it helps to think about the different needs that people have on a spectrum, from what we can do individually and what we can only do collectively. So every need is different. Every need requires a customized approach. And at one end, we typically would expect to buy things for ourselves through individual cash payments in the marketplace. So you've got food, maybe the internet. At the other end, we depend on collective action through our public institutions, through universal services and other collective forms of collective action. Right across the spectrum, if we are going to ensure that everyone has sufficient access to the ways of meeting their needs, we usually need a combination of of individual and collective contributions, which I'll try and explain a bit more later on. So that's the spectrum of needs. We don't want services to meet all our needs, but there are some needs that can only be met through collective action. This is the book that I wrote that was published in 2020. I used to be able to say last year, but it's now more than a year old, but only just. And it's the Case for Universal Basic Services. And it's also a paper that we've published through the New Economics Foundation, which goes into more detail and was published last year. So universal services are about pooling resources and sharing risks and working together so that we can all meet all of our needs. So we want to improve existing services like education and healthcare, but the key thing is to build new services in key areas of need where there isn't universal access. So among those, we would focus on childcare, social care, housing, and access to transport and the internet. And the idea is to make sure that everyone has access according to need, not ability to pay. And this is a big vision, it's a big idea, but it's possible to start small and local and build from the bottom up. Now, although every one of our needs has to be met in a different way, what the social guarantee offers is a framework that it's a principled framework that can be applied in every case. So that framework includes things like, we know this is about investment in the social infrastructure, not just public expenditure. So we value and build the social infrastructure, and we know that it yields social, economic, and environmental returns. That what we need, that having access to the things that we need, is a universal entitlement. It's not a privilege or a concession. Everyone has a right to the things that will meet their needs. And this isn't about top-down state-only provision. We would recognize the need for and encourage multiple models of provider, of ownership and control. So you can have state control through national and local government, or you could have through third sector organizations, social enterprises, co-ops, trusts, and so forth. But all providers would share the same set of public interest obligations through a system called social licensing, which we've been thinking about with the people who are working on the foundational economy. Some of you will be aware of that. it's just a way of making sure that all providers treat their workers right, reach the right quality standards, follow practices that are ecologically sustainable, minimize profit extraction, that kind of thing. We want to put people in control. So with the big decisions grounded in democratic dialogue through citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries, and at the service level, people who use the services, designing them and where possible, co-producing them with service workers. And that sustainability is built in, so all collective measures are designed to meet climate goals and stay within planetary boundaries. And what we're doing here is we're trying to learn from a great deal of experience that we've got about the welfare state, successes and failures of existing services. So there's plenty to build on. What works well? What do we not want to repeat about the post-war welfare settlement? How can we, there's a lot to learn on, to build on, and that's what we're trying to do here. And as I said earlier, this is both a big idea, it's a radical idea, but it's also pragmatic. It can be introduced gradually and developed incrementally. Now, within that framework, governments have got several really important functions. They may, in some cases, be the appropriate provider of services, but certainly not in all. What the job of governments is to do is to ensure equal access, both within and between localities. So we want devolved power, but we don't want some regions to have more power than others. And the only way you can have that kind of equality is through the national state. We want governments to set and enforce standards and obligations on providers that I've been talking about, to collect and invest funds through taxation and other means, and to support local control and diverse kinds of ownership for providers, and to coordinate services across the different sectors for the best outcomes. So key roles for government, but this is not how governments are normally thought of when it comes to service provision. So it's the government as an enabler, as an ensurer of equality and so forth, and standards. Now, I don't think I'm going to have time in this presentation to talk very much about it in practice, but what we've tried to do is to look around other countries, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere too, to find out where we would look to say, well, what would the ideal universal service look like in the different areas of need? So when it comes to childcare, we'd look at Norway, for example. I'm not going to stop on this slide, or indeed on the next one, where we recognize that providing housing as a universal service is not about giving everybody a free house, but is about a package of measures that ensure that housing is affordable, that it's of good quality, that it's sustainable, that neighborhoods are congenial, that they're well connected with public transport, that they encourage sustainable living. And there are all sorts of measures that you can bring to bear on housing in order to help make that happen, which might include things like public land ownership and methods of planning and so on, which we can learn from other countries, from Vienna, from Freiburg, from Copenhagen, where most large majority of housing is in cooperative control, which is an interesting example. So that's what we've done, and that's all set out in the book and also on our website. So now I wanted to say something about food, because this is well, food is one of those basic needs that we expect to pay for ourselves in the marketplace. And it's important that everybody has enough money so that they can afford to put food on the table. But it would be a mistake to imagine that money will make it possible for everyone to have access to nutritious food. So what we need is a combination of policies that will enable everyone to have enough money to buy food, but also things that governments do to make sure that food is sustainably produced, to encourage local production, to restrict advertising of foods that are harmful, to promote affordable diets, and to, in the case of public bodies, provide food to people who use things like schools and hospitals and prisons, food that is nutritious and good for people. So that's a much more complicated picture. But the key point here is that it's not enough just to say people need money so they can buy food. You need to think of a package of collective measures, things we do together through our governments to make sure that everyone has access to nutritious food, not just can go and buy food wherever it's possible. Now, just as I'm getting to the end of my presentation, I wanted to talk about the connection between services and money. Both are obviously essential, and I like to think of them as two sides of the same coin. So if you're thinking about how do you make sure everyone has access to things that meet their needs, to life's essentials, they need both. They need money and they need services. But we need to understand that universal services represent or are a social income, a social wage. They're in-kind benefits, collectively funded, and they're sufficient and universal, and they're available to everyone who needs them, regardless of ability to pay. And they have value as in-kind benefits. So a larger social income means that people need less cash in order to live a decent life, to meet their needs and to flourish. I mean, and one little example there, that if childcare were a free service, then a lone parent with one child under school age would need £7,500 less or thereabouts in order to meet a minimum income standard. So never underestimate the displaced value, monetary value, if you like, of services to people. So if you want to do something about poverty, giving people money isn't the only thing you need to do. You need to make sure that those services are there and that they're of high quality, and they're not undermined by a cash payment system that will absorb all the funds and not leave enough to improve and extend our public services. So the point there is that cash payments and services must be mutually reinforcing. So we need a cash benefit system. We need a fair living wage, that's very important, but we also need a cash benefit system that is compatible with the fact that we need more public funds through taxation and possibly through other means too, in order to improve and extend the services that will enable us all to have access to life's essentials. So the more public money that's spent on cash payments, the more universal services could be starved of funds. And people often say, oh, well, never mind, we can always raise more money. There's always more money out there. Look at what happened during COVID and so on. However, yes, it is possible to find additional money very often, but that is urgently needed for climate mitigation measures, for green infrastructure, as well as for more and better collective action and services to help us all meet our needs. So we would favour not universal basic income, where you pay money to people whether they need it or not, but a system of a guaranteed minimum income, because that's far less expensive. And we think it makes a much more compatible companion, if you like, with universal services. So just in conclusion to say, that the idea is to move towards sustainable well-being, to take you back to that first slide I showed you about a safe and just space for humanity. The social guarantee is about reclaiming and reimagining the collective ideal that inspired the post-war welfare state, with a principled framework to guide policy and practice so that we can achieve secure foundations for everyone. And it builds in-kind benefits in order to enhance the social wage or the virtual income. And there are substantial gains in there for employment, because services are an extremely abundant source of relatively secure forms of employment at all skills levels right across the country. And also, and I haven't got time to go into this, with there's a lot of evidence that this approach brings real benefits in terms of equity, efficiency, solidarity, and ecological sustainability. So what we want to do is to combine universality with sufficiency so that provisioning systems can stay within planetary boundaries. And this is all about, not about individual consumption, but about shared and public consumption as a route to changing our behavior collectively so that we can change the way we think about what really matters and be able to work towards a sustainable future. And that's where you can find out more. That's our website, and that's the link to the NEF paper. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. That's great. So that really two very interesting talks, lots to think about. So if you have some, you can give together if you want. Do you want to read them out, Gary?
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Sorry, I skipped out for a minute. Say that again, Janie. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So do you want to read out your two questions? Because one could then, read out your first two questions.
Gee,
What is in UBI? The first, shall I read them then? Because you probably, it's right up at the very top.
Oh, well, yeah, okay. It says, the question is, what is in UBI for the middle class?
Yeah.
In other words, it goes to the other questions I asked down below, which is, these are wonderful dreams and ideas about living in a nirvana. The question is, I can't argue with the moral and the good for society perspective. It's wonderful. How do you get there? How do we move our public and thus our government to begin to look at it in this way?
Shall I try and give a response from a UBI perspective?
Yeah, you do, and then I'll ask Anna to reply from her perspective. Yes.
So I think there's lots of things to say, but two things I'll stick to. I mean, one of the interesting things about UBI, as I tried to show in that graph, is that a large majority of people benefit. Now, the people who don't benefit in sheer economic terms, in just terms of cash, are the top 15%, maybe top 20%. But that leaves 80% benefiting. So when we're talking about the middle classes, even in a short-term, selfish, narrow interest sense, then we're actually talking quite a small group of the population in democratic terms. We know they're the ones who influence and control political parties. So, I'm not trying to pretend it's too easy. But there is something in basic income's basic design which lends itself to attracting popular support. And the other thing about it, I think, is, and I think this is, it's a challenging thing to say, we've gone through decades of decline of social security in the UK. I think similarly, actually, in the US, it seems to be particularly English-speaking countries that have allowed inequality to really rocket away and the levels of basic security to decline. And that's an interesting conversation itself. I think like basic income has, a bit like in the UK, the National Health Service, it's a proposition that's actually quite easy to understand. So we can have a debate, and we will debate strengths, weaknesses, whatever. But if you get the idea, then it's, I think, something you can mobilize around. And I think that's why, if you look into what UBI Lab Network has achieved in terms of getting political support in Northern Ireland, in Wales, in councils up and down the land, and in terms of ordinary people, and in terms of some of the polling you see, people are getting it. People are starting to understand that we need a radically different way of organizing economic security. So I'm not naive about it, but I mean, one of the reasons I support it is not just because it's right, but because I think it's got the potential to be popular and backed by ordinary people and turned into a real reform.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Anna, is there anything you want to say? Is there any comment you want to make?
Yes, I think it's the question was what's in it for the middle classes, and this is about UBI, not about universal basic services and the social guarantee. So I think we need to.
Anna, I think it was about both. He was saying what we
Okay,
both said.
well, he was also.
I definitely.
I'll just answer this. Okay.
I definitely was saying about both, I thought.
Okay. So
Thank you, Gary.
I think we should ask ourselves why it is that universal basic income is so popular with the tycoons of Silicon Valley. Now, my theory is, and I can't support this with any evidence, but it's very interesting why they do support this, is because they want to go on making lots of money with their businesses, and they want to make sure that people don't rise up in the streets and they've got just enough money to go on shopping. And so that's one thing I think we should bear in mind. That's a very dangerous proposition for me, because what UBI doesn't do is it promises everyone some money, and who's going to say that's a bad idea? Who's going to say? But it doesn't do anything to change the way people get rich. It doesn't do anything really to tackle inequalities. And I think another question is worth asking ourselves is, why is it that for 30 years there's been a campaign for universal basic income, and there have been so-called experiments all around the world, and not a single government, you could say with the one exception, which is Alaska, the state of Alaska, and I could say more about that, has actually put it into practice. And the reason is that it's a sort of a silver bullet solution. You can do it all in one. Here we are, money for everyone. But it costs such a lot of money. And there are so many things you can't do if you're going to invest, put that money into basic income, that's why it's never happened. And I think you will find that the Scottish government, which began as thinking it would be a nice idea to have some trials on universal basic income, now support the idea of a guaranteed minimum income, which I think is what we should be talking about really, and far more interested in developing universal basic services. And just to come back to that question of, is it nirvana? How can we get there? How can we put it into practice? The whole point about the social guarantee and the idea of universal services and the idea of universal service working together to make sure everyone gets what they need is that you can start small. You can start with local experiments just aimed at maybe one area of need. I mean, they've done this in Camden Council where they've decided to try to help poor families get access to the internet. So that's their way of starting. So you start in small way and you can build up.
Are you going to answer every question by using it as an excuse to attack universal basic income?
I was very good before, Simon. I was very good before. I didn't.
Were you?
I think it is a really dangerous idea. And I also think it is a very dangerous idea to suggest that government should give that we should all become dependent on the government for this money. It's a single lever. You imagine what this government would do with universal basic income. Look what they did to universal credit. They gave everyone an extra 20 quid a week, and then they turned the lever the other way. So but with services, although of course governments can do enormous damage to services, you've got far more diffused power and far more interest groups all around the country who can defend it. It's not something the Treasury can just turn on and off at a whim. So I think it's but
I think it does a disservice to the debate if you answer a question by answering a completely different question. That's my point, Anna.
Well, Simon, I could go back to your presentation and take issue with every slide. I've not done that. So
I don't mind having a debate with you, but you just chose
May I ask a question? May I try to ask a question that we structure the debate?
Can I just intervene here? I think let's move on to some of the other questions, okay? I'm sure this other aspects of the debate will come out in that.
Well, I think I need to intervene just briefly here. Alberta tried this in the 1930s, where there's a party called the Social Credit Party in Canada, in Alberta, and the Social Credit Party won 85% of the seats at the elections in 1934, I think it was, and the central government stopped them from implementing the policy. And I think what stood behind the central government was the financial system, the bankers. They didn't want to see that happen. So it has been a popular mandate by the people who understood what it meant. So I'm not sure where Anna says it hasn't been used before.
Okay, I think there is apparently James Locke. Are you? Yeah, are you? No, you're James John Carlyle. I think James Locke has provided here in the chat a map of UBI experiments across the world. So Gary, you might be interested to have a look at that, follow up on that. Let me now move on. I'm going to move on to one or two questions, other questions. I think, Gary, that there's also information about what a UBI lab is in the chat provided by Reinhardt.
Yeah, thanks everybody for putting all that information in. I tried to write it down.
You.
I hope we can get a copy of this somehow.
Yes, you will get a copy, yes. I'm moving down now. I have a question here from Telemac. Is he there to ask the question? It's about the notion of unconditionality. And I think he's asking both speakers to comment on that.
On that, yes. Well, thank you very much for two very interesting presentations. I'm going to be brief. Just give me a second of trust, if you will. It's just that I'm actually talking to you from a Paris suburb, which is applying to the UBI Lab network, and I will be presenting next week in the UBI Lab.
If you don't mind, Telemac, we'll hear about that later.
Yes, no, but it's very much to the question, because I will be presenting about the history of the basic income definition. I just want to bring up that until 2016, not doing the presentation, talking of basic income in kind was conform to the definition of the World Network. And basic income in kind is another way you could say universal basic services. So this is a point. And so to the question straight up is, so Mr. Duffy, you presented UBI as being universal basic income, which I found a bit strange, because generally the shift from basic income to UBI, from BI to UBI, it was more on unconditional basic income than on universal, and the point on unconditionality. And no, in Mrs. Coote's presentation, she mentioned briefly, I don't know, because her camera just went off, that she talked about the living wage in passing, and about social income at some points. So basically in that notion of UBS, there will be some form of income guarantee. So my question, since the title and, the debate here, the title of tonight's talk was very much UBI or UBS, complementary or concurrent or competitive, and yet in both of your presentation it was obvious that you did make a huge effort so that at the end we could see the concord and not very much the point of discord. And so I'm just trying to figure out where is exactly the point of opposition here. So maybe asking this more closely to Ms. Coote. So is there a difference between your living wage and your social income, and how conditional is this? What's your position on the Malibu surfer, to take the example that was famous in the basic income literature? Would you feed the Malibu surfer, or say that because he doesn't contribute to the social activity, if someone refuses to take a job, should that person be handed out the basic services and the basic income or not? And is your opposition to basic income entirely driven by the idea that it would be that basic income would replace completely all forms of social services? Or if there is a basic income proposal that says, well, there's a complementarity between basic income and basic services, would you support this? So thank you very much again.
Do you want me to
Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, well, we recognise that if everyone's going to get access to life's essentials, that they have to have both money and in-kind benefits, and but the prevailing mood, if you like, or the weight of the debate around UBI is not to put any emphasis really on the services, on the in-kind benefits. And I think that people undervalue the enormous importance of the collective services. So what would it be like? How much money would you need as universal basic income if you had no healthcare, if you had no education, if you if you had nothing to keep the rents down? Well, we know what that's like in this country anyway. So so it's thinking in those terms. So what we're trying to do is to get people to think about the relationship between cash benefits, if you like, and in-kind benefits. And with cash benefits, I put the living wage, so money and in-kind services. And the only thing that I've got, well, I have two things against UBI. One is the huge expense that would take money away from all the things we need to do to improve and extend collective services. Okay, and the other thing is the ideological message that doesn't come from everyone in the UBI movement, but is quite strong, and I picked it up in Simon's presentation, is that really, we don't really want a welfare state anymore. We want people to just have money and to go out into the marketplace and buy stuff. And that's what UBI is about. So I worry about UBI on terms of the overriding huge expense of paying everybody anywhere near what could be an adequate income. And then this ideological message, which I think is very dangerous.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Simon, would you like to respond to that, and also to Telemach's question about the notion of unconditionality?
Yeah, I think I probably did. It was on one slide, Telemach, but for me, it's really important. Unconditionality is an essential element of universal basic income because insofar as people need income, which in the real world they do, it means that people have a human right to have economic security unconditionally, in the sense that now then the Malibu surfer is safe on my model. I just think it's a matter of human decency. And the interesting thing is, if we treat people in that way, the evidence suggests actually they're more productive in lots of different ways. But it's important to start from that foundation. With regard to Anna's last comment, I mean, I'm a bit gobsmacked. I mean, I've spent so long defending the welfare state and trying to also articulate what a good welfare state would look like that I don't even know where to begin. Universal basic income is part of modernizing the welfare state. Other parts of the welfare state, the NHS is a good example. Structurally, the principle of the welfare state, the principle of the NHS rather, free universal healthcare is essential part of the welfare state. And I don't know where she gets any sense that I would be against that. What I think is interesting is to distinguish the different elements of the public services we need. You wouldn't organize food like you would organize healthcare and many, many other things as well. And so I just think it's important to be thoughtful about the different kinds of things we need in life. And I'll go back to, I mean, in Anna's presentation, she had it down at the collective end, social care as the second, as the penultimate most collectivized arrangement. But disabled people in this country have been arguing for a long time to, in a sense, decollectivize that because they want control over it. Actually, they want to then connect, collaborate, cooperate with the resources they get. But it's very important to them that the existing collective institutional provision be basically stripped away and replaced with something more appropriate, more consistent with human rights. So there are all sorts of interesting questions about how we organize the welfare state. And I certainly am critical of, and the NHS itself, while its central principle is great, it's organized an incredibly centralized way. I mean, you know, Sheffield's services are not accountable to the people of Sheffield. They're accountable to some bizarre administrative unit that doesn't have any relationship to our citizenry at all. So we've seen these kind of weird management things going on. So I think that, yeah, for me, universal basic income's pushing this boundary of saying we've got to stop government and business controlling ordinary people, and we need to give people the right to have economic resources independently of government and business, so they can determine their lifestyle in a way that matches their gifts, so that they can develop in the way that they need to. So it's basically rooted in a sense that human beings fundamentally are good, that they can organize many things themselves better, including public services, which need to be public and need to be collective, but need to be democratically accountable too.
Thank you, Simon. I'm coming down here. I think Gary's question about the Nirvana idea has been answered. So I have two questions here from Reinhard, which are for Anna, but Simon also might want to comment later. So Reinhard, do you want to read out your questions?
Yes, thank you, Janie, and thank you both speakers for their very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. I really enjoyed listening to both of you. My question, and because I'm sort of coordinator of UBI Lab Leeds, I don't want to ask questions to Simon, but Anna, I've listened to several presentations, and always I'm missing arts and sports in your slides, and I want to ask you, yeah, where do they appear? Because for me, I'm by background a medical doctor, but I have a positive view of health, not just as the absence of disease, but of complete spiritual, physical, social well-being. So arts and sports are very important contribution to health. And that's one reason why I'm in favor of basic income, but maybe you can explain how it can be provided as basic service. The second one is more, you always talk about autonomy. I would add agency. How can this be achieved without a basic income? I've worked in many places as a doctor where state bureaucrats have imposed various things in terms of work, in terms of services on citizens, and especially the poorer citizens have almost no option to resist, to reject. Obviously, basic income is just one ingredient, but for me, it's an important ingredient to actually create autonomy and agency of citizens. And so I would like to know what your opinion is about this aspect of basic income. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anna, would you like to respond to those?
Yes, well, on the art and sports side, I think that needs to be seen as an important part of collective provision, because it's what you get through further education, it's what you get through schools, it's what you get through the access to green spaces. There's a whole area of local authority activity usually, or things that are within the remit, if you like, of local authorities, where people have got the opportunity to do art and to do sport, but you couldn't just do it if you left it to people individually. It does have a strong collective element. So although it's not part of the ones that we are, and I made this very clear at the beginning, although we do focus on particular kinds of areas of need, that I certainly agree that things like art and sport and general exercise, access to green spaces, street lighting, sewage, refuse collection, there's a whole range of things there that we couldn't do ourselves, that we have to do and want to do together, and we need to pool our resources in order to do that. And so this brings us back to this trade-off between, what kind of measure are we going to have to make sure everybody's got enough money? If we're really concerned to not just to hang on to, but to improve and extend these collective ways of enabling people to do what they need. And that's where we come back to this question of whether it's best to have something that combines a fair living wage with a minimum income guarantee. Now, a minimum income guarantee, this idea is that everyone has the right not to have their income fall below an agreed level of sufficiency. So there, and this is, I mean, we've got lots of experience in this country of getting people together to agree, to draw up a consensus about what is enough money. It's done through Loughborough University, it's the minimum income standard. We've got lots of ways of doing this. So we establish what an agreed minimum is, and everybody has a right to an income that doesn't fall below that level. Now, what that means is you don't pay money to people who've got more than that. You do have to demonstrate that you have enough money, or you don't have enough money, but it's rather like, you know, when it comes to healthcare, you only get the healthcare you need. So they don't give everyone a plaster cast. They only give a plaster cast to people who've got a broken arm. And similarly, you only give income to people who need the income. So there is conditionality there. There's conditionality. You only give schooling to children below a certain age. You give maybe different kinds of education above that. And Simon quite rightly made the distinction between different kinds of social care and what's appropriate for some people and what's appropriate for others. And I would be the first to agree, it has to be much better organized and designed with much more input from the people who are using the services. So first of all, you need a really broad range of much improved services and collective activities. Services is a difficult word to use because it does suggest that we're doing things to people, but it's about things that are co-produced by people who use the services and the service workers right across this range, including arts and sports and access to green spaces and so on. And in order to ensure that we would have security of having that, we've got to come up with a more sensible approach to the income bit. And the income bit comprises a fair living wage and a guaranteed minimum income. It's not perfect, but nothing is perfect. UBI certainly isn't perfect.
But I mean, when you say, do you say that really all arts and sport activities should be made free at user point? Because I mean, I like swimming, I like cycling. So different people have different interests in arts and sport. So if you would take into account that we are all different, then in universal basic services, every service in terms of art and sport should be free at user point, which I think is exactly what you claim for UBI.
No,
incredibly expensive for society.
No, that's not what I said. What we say about services is that they are available to all according to need, not ability to pay. I would like it very much if everybody who wanted to go cycling could have access to a bicycle that they could enjoy. I don't think people should not be able to go cycling or to take a bike to get to work, if you like, or to school, because they couldn't afford one, right? That is not the same as the government giving everyone the same bike, which is a kind of old top-down model. So wherever you go, the principle is that people have access to what they need, not what they can afford to pay for. It's about needs, it's about sufficiency. It's not about just satisfying everybody's wants. I mean, there are other things that we will do that we won't be providing collectively. And we have democratic means of making those decisions. You asked about agency, and I think you get agency by having security, that you will get the healthcare you need. You get agency through education, learning things at school. You get agency by having a decent home that you can rely on. And that's the basis of security that enables people to have agency in life. And the only answer is that just giving people money or giving everyone money, which will only be a little bit of money anyway, because we wouldn't be able to afford enough money for everyone to live on. And even if we did that, it would be too much power for the state who's giving the money. So it's about giving people, enabling people to have access to life's essentials.
Okay, Anna, thank you very much. I can see that actually the next question, I think from James Locke, is also probably one for you at least to respond to initially. James, are you there?
I am indeed here. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm really interested to hear a non-combative view between these two ideas. I'm interested to hear a vision for how they might come together and what they might achieve together. I'd like to hear that from both speakers.
Well, if I could start, that's exactly what the social guarantee is trying to do. It's trying to say, if everyone...
I'm not sure that's entirely true, Anna, I'm sorry.
Well, all right, then what's the point of my answering your question?
Well, one is an unconditional offer of income and one is a means-tested version of that. And they are quite distinct models. So I'm trying to encourage you to think more collaboratively.
Well, then let me say that I think that they're not compatible. Unconditional basic income is not compatible for ideological and fiscal reasons with a collective approach to ensuring universal access to life's essentials.
Okay, well, that's a very clear response. Simon, do you want to come? I mean, Gary, I notice has a question here about.
No, well, I think this is a good opportunity for me to try and say something, isn't it, that about the compatibility of it, but also the importance of the universal element of this. So the problem, some of this, I find it. I remember the very first economics lessons I was ever given at university taught me the difference between public spending and cash transfers. And a lot of this debate seems to me to muddle those two things up. So, I mean, many of you are members of Café Économique, so you probably don't need this little bit of reminder of basic economics, but the basic thought is this: cash transfers kind of redistribute income, but they're not spending any money. They're kind of the spending of money. So organizing our affairs so that everybody gets enough money through a basic income and the necessary taxes to pay for it is just another way of describing redistribution without public spending. And actually the net cost, as people like, well, many calculations of this, but the net cost of this on GDP is quite modest and small percentage, 3, 4, 5% of GDP. So that's why this understanding how really income and redistribution is not public spending is really rather important, because if you conflate them, you get in a bit of a muddle. But as Anna quite rightly says, there are still lots of things that collectively we might decide to spend our resources on, in addition to doing the job of transferring resources between us. And healthcare is a really good example of where, that has to be done. Education is another example where, we look at the student debt crisis that New Labour opened up for us. All of these things need to be removed. We need to get people out of debt. We need to get people with this combination of secure incomes and good services. But we do need both things. Now, the reason why I like minimum income guarantee insofar as it achieves one thing we don't currently have, which it starts to clarify what sufficient means. Okay, that is really important, and that is progress. So compared to where we are currently, I think it's good that Neff and Anna are advocating a minimum income guarantee. Of course, UBI is saying, well, yes, we need that minimum income guarantee, and the best way to organize that is effectively to give everybody the income to begin with, and then to effectively increase taxes for the income after that income. And so what this means economically is that you do need to increase the marginal rate of tax on people on higher earners. Now, what the minimum income guarantee doesn't do is that. What it does instead is it perpetuates means testing that targets the highest marginal rates of tax on the poorest. And that's where I hate it. I mean, it seems to me socially unjust to say that the people on the lowest incomes should pay the highest marginal rates of tax. They do now pay the highest marginal rates of tax. They even pay the highest average tax. The poorest 10% pay 10% more of their income than the rest of the population, extraordinarily. But I think as a matter of social justice and of good human common sense, we should be taking burdens off the poorest. And that includes the extra taxation created by means testing. So that's what a lot of the argument around, say, minimum income guarantee versus UBI is. It's a choice about who's paying the higher marginal rates of tax. I think it should be the middle class. I think it should be people who are earning good salaries like Anna and other people. And I think people on very low incomes should not be paying those hyper marginal rates of tax. That's what that is all ultimately about.
Thank you for that clarification. That's helpful. I think there's a question from Priscilla. Priscilla, do you want to read out your question?
Not income tax.
Priscilla, are you unmuted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Well, yes, I'm just trying to move down to it. But what I was basically asking was, and this is really a question for Anna, the idea of these community-based services that I think you're proposing. I mean, I can't really see how this can be done. For instance, reforming local NHS patterns, etc., so that there is more input from patients. I mean, all this seems to depend on having a very powerful central government that would direct all this. I mean, I'll be interested to hear how you think these things could happen. I mean, you said something about Camden Council or what they were doing. Could you give us an example of how you might do these things, assuming that we've still got a Conservative government? I mean, how could you do that?
Okay, shall I answer that?
Yes,
please. Okay. The thing is that we have to put our trust in people working together at local level who can do an awful lot in spite of where the government is now. I mean, I think you can't really think about introducing a social guarantee with the government that we have at the moment, but you can look to local authorities who working with the third sector organizations to do the best they can in their own localities. So that's how, I mean, leave aside whether we think we can overhaul the entire NHS just right now. I think I would very much like to improve and extend the NHS and make it a much more preventative outfit. But I want to put that one on one side for the time being and just talk about what people can do locally. I mean, there's a wonderful history of local action, working together with and without local councils to provide services that enable people to help each other and themselves. But what my worry about that, most of you will probably remember the Big Society. Do you remember the Big Society, David Cameron's Big Society? And he thought, let's just hand over responsibility to local people and let them get on with it. And it was a way of winding down the welfare, shifting responsibility, if you like, from government to people without much concern about whether people were able to, or equally able or unable to take responsibility for meeting needs at a local level. So what we need is a government that's able to distribute funds so that localities have enough money and enough resources generally, including service workers, to work with local people to get the things they need, and people being enabled to do this locally through the way that organizations get together, and particularly through the actions of local government. And I think this is eminently possible and can be done. And that's why I think that the idea of the social guarantee it's both a big idea and it's sort of radical and pragmatic, because it can be done in small ways, and it can be done by local authorities thinking, well, all right, so let's decide with local people what we think the most urgent necessity is for people in this community. And something like this went on in Camden Council. They said, okay, we want everyone to have access to things that meet their needs. How can we start? And they decided, partly because of the pandemic, But the most urgent thing was for poor families in that borough. And they'd like it to have been for everyone, but they knew that there were some people who couldn't get access to the internet because they didn't have the equipment or the access to the broadband or the skills to do it. And so they set about making that available to a small group of people in Camden to see what difference it would make, which is rather, you know, it's a small beginning, but it's something that shows this is what we're getting at here, finding out what it is that people need, what can be done together to meet those needs, and how can local authorities work with local people and local organisations in order to make that happen.
Thanks very much, Anna. I see there's a question here from John Carlisle about government interference. John, do you want to give your question? John Carlisle? Seems to have gone, maybe he left, I don't know.
It applies to both UBI and UBS. And I think Anna is right with her reservations about the government providing or not the income. Basically, they can reduce it, they can do what they want with it. And my question is, how do you ring fence the money that will go into UBI, for example, so the Treasury doesn't decide, doesn't interfere with it and make it available? Now, Simon talks about it coming from taxes, but ultimately, how does one derive that money in order to provide the basic income without interference from the Treasury?
And does your question also apply to universal basic services as well?
Yes, it does.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
and Anna pointed it out.
Yeah, well, maybe we could start there with Simon.
Sure, yeah, John. Of course, we're in this kind of fascist Tory death spiral that we've been in for a good decade now, aren't we? And so it's very hard to be optimistic about the actual politics and the economics system that we're surviving in. So we have to dream a little bit, don't we? The way I think about it is that UBI has, minimum income guarantee has this, again, 50% of this, because it just disguises the issue of the marginal tax rate on the poor, but it at least starts to identify what is essential. And we've seen, actually, at the moment, one of the things that has, until very recently, well, it's still been well protected, is the triple lock pension. And I think things that get protected tend to have kind of clarity and public awareness and a sense of universality about them. So the very fact that a universal basic income is something that everybody gets, even though it seems to irritate people that the rich will get it and pay more tax so that they will be worse off, but they will still get it. So again, it's an interesting, I think, having something that everybody gets, having something that's a clear amount helps. If I was dreaming, John, and I did include this briefly in my talk, for Citizen Network, we're also very interested in constitutional reform. And for us, we would include human rights and social economic rights in the Constitution. So then it's the job of the Constitution to have arrangements to, for instance, have people identify what it is that is essential that people have, not just in terms of income, but also in terms of other access to public services. So I think we do need to also shift our thinking so that we're not just thinking in terms of an economic instrument or a public service, but what is the system of constitutional guarantees, civil structures that underpins that? What the Tories have proved since 2010 is that the welfare state is incredibly vulnerable, that they can get away with all sorts of attacks on it, and that no aspect of our civil society structures has been able to stop them. And it's fascinating in a really awful way to see how successful they've been at attacking things. And so I think if we can turn a corner and move away from this era, then we'll have to move beyond just saying, this is my favorite flavor of services, or this is my favorite income transfer scheme. We've got to go beneath that and start to say, what are the political, social, constitutional guarantees that will protect our arrangements for social justice?
So you're saying we need a written constitution?
Personally, that's what Citizen Network advocates, and other measures, to be honest, John. It's not just about the written constitution. It's about all of the arrangements that make that constitution come to life. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Anna, do you want to respond in relation to UBS? How do you limit government interference?
I think the constitutional route is an interesting one. I mean, we can see that there are several countries that have social rights written into their constitutions, and although there's usually a huge distance between what's in a constitution and what actually happens in practice, it's a way of signaling that this is important. And so, yes, I mean, I think that embedding the idea of social rights in a written constitution is a good idea. I mean, I'm not sure I would start there, because I think we can make a good start just by, you know, small bits of local practice, and also by putting pressure on governments to do things like sort out the social care system, which they could do, and extend lifelong learning and many things like that. But I think that if you're talking about how can you lock it in, that the idea of a written constitution that enshrines social as well as economic rights is a brilliant idea.
Okay, thank you very much. That's some interesting points there. I have a question here from James, which is kind of how you view a sort of more unified approach with UBS and UBI coming together. James, are you there? Is James still around?
No, he's gone. I think he asked his question actually, James.
Oh, did he?
He
Oh,
did.
sorry, I must have missed that. Okay, right, sure. Okay. Wait a minute. I think that just seeing if there's any other questions here. They're mostly comments rather than questions, actually, interestingly. There's somebody, Richard, you have a question here. Does anyone think UBI or UBS will work alone? Do you want to comment on give your question?
Yes, it's really the obvious thing. I think Simon referred to paying for UBI out of income tax. Absolutely quite right, except that wealth in the UK, wealth inequality is at record levels, and we really need to start taxing wealth as well as income.
Yep.
You want to comment on that? I mean, I agree. I'd tax almost everything if I could. but yes, I mean, I suppose I limit myself a little bit in terms of my simple modelling work to income, because I think it just shows how achievable it is. And taxing wealth is slightly harder to model, actually. And I think actually taxing wealth, given that a lot of that wealth is in capital and property, is also an important part of getting a better housing system. But basically, I agree. I'm certainly, and I suppose the key point, going back to just the levels of inequality, which have grown and grown for income and wealth, is that I think if as a society we're going to actually reverse the direction we've been on, which really started to come in the late 60s and early 70s, where people started to just say, oh, well, maybe we'll allow a bit more inequality. And they didn't, it's a very thin end of the wedge situation. And we can talk about the public policy and philosophical reasons that this happened. But for whatever reason, we need to radically change direction. We need to radically increase equality and attack inequality. Now, how do you get a society that's gone through like 50 years really of decline against a measure of social justice to change its attitude? And that's where I think basic income is quite helpful, because it's a whole new message to the society. We're all in this together. We all contribute. We all need the security of a basic income. And it's on that basis that I think you can kind of eat away and attack some of the hanging on to extreme wealth and income. And you can mobilize people because actually so many of them will have something to gain from this system. So I see basic income actually as a kind of tool in the battle to achieve radical equality, which is what I want, as much equality as we can pull off, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Saeed Hashimi has a question, which I think for Anna, actually. Saeed, are you there? Or is he gone? I don't know. I mean, anyway.
He must be there because he just put something in the chat.
Oh, right. Okay.
He's there.
Hi, yeah, which question are you referring to? I think I mostly
This is the first time I'm seeing somebody argue against UBI in favor of UBS. You said you haven't heard of UBS before, and then you said,
oh yeah, this was just a comment because I've generally, I've been following UBI a lot, and it's the first time I've seen someone argue against it, not to dismiss the argument outright without discussion. Of course, I'm just surprised that it's a counter argument to UBI as opposed to maybe this is a better way of doing UBI. That's all, not really a question.
Oh, because you're mentioning at the bottom, why would the government have to operate services if they can just give people money? I noticed at the end.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, this gets into like what you envision to be, exactly done. For example, healthcare. We don't typically talk about UBI as stripping away healthcare or stripping away schools. I'm in Canada for context, but I think a lot of the things are similar between the UK in some ways, universal healthcare, et cetera. There's generally not really an idea that we're going to remove healthcare. For example, the government of Ontario here is going to be running redoing a trial of the Conservatives repealed to try UBI, but there's no talk of doing this at the expense of other social services. And of course, the collective bargaining that's involved in Medicare is beneficial. And I don't think anyone really wants to strip that away in favor of UBI. It's really just a cash transfer. And in cases where you need insurance because of pre-existing conditions and the market will not respond to that, we've already sort of figured those things out. Most of the argument for UBI is that we don't want the welfare cliff. We don't want means-tested welfare where you have to go before a government official and say, I'm out of a job and now, I need money for this and I need money for that. And could you please provide me this? Could you please provide me that? A lot of this is already figured out in the market. Now there's things like housing where there's a paper from Ezra Klein where there's a cost disease issue where you actually have a shortage, and that shortage is fundamentally on the supply side. And no matter how much money you throw at it, you're not going to fix it. Even if you throw UBI at everyone, rents for the smallest housing units are just going to go up and you're just going to fall into this vicious cycle. Now that's usually where the anti-market position comes from, is that you see these things, you see the monopolies where some group is going to get priced out. Even if you give everyone cash, they're just going to keep pricing out the bottom 10% somehow. That sort of negative viewpoint, I find, has to do with these sorts of things where the market it's facing a problem, and that usually comes from the government. So land use is done by the government, where zoning restricts how much housing you can have, et cetera, and so that pushes rents up. And so both of these are necessary. You need to remove the cost disease. You need to allow more physicians per capita, whether you're in the healthcare sector. You need to allow more housing units to be built. Remove the zoning regulations, limit how many housing units you can build. All these things, and then giving cash to those who the market is not paying them for their labor enough to be within the median range of incomes. So what you really want to do with UBI is alleviate that sort of bottom 20% or so, or you can see it in the income distribution graphs, where it's sort of like you don't fit in the labor market. But then there's also other issues where it's, there's market failures, and you can address those separately. And that's not really a failure of UBI, or that we should do government operated services as opposed to market operated services. Housing is a great example because whether you do public housing or private housing, you say, you know, we pay everyone $2,000 or pounds for the UK a month to rent a place, or whether you say the government has to run government housing for everyone. The issues are the same here because the issues are that you're not allowed to build enough houses. You're not allowed to build enough homes. So whether it's the government going to do that, local control is going to say, no, don't build this in my town. I don't want any more homes. Whether it's a private developer who's going to do that, they're still going to oppose this, and you know, you're going to end up in the same spot. So some of these things are not like, do you give them cash or do you let the government do it? Some of it is just, you know, at the root of the problem, there's a supply problem. You don't have enough of the thing to go around. You can't redistribute your way out of that. And so that's sort of
yeah. So do you have a specific question or was it more of a comment? I mean, I don't know whether
it was a comment from the start. Sorry, just because you went into that, I sort of went into the whole spiel, but sorry about that. Thanks.
I don't know whether, Anna, you have anything to say to that or any comment you want to make?
I found it a bit hard to follow, to be honest, but you did pick up the business of land value tax, and I think that that is in one of your comments, and I think that's something we can probably all violently agree on, that it would be a good way of part of a package, if you like, of collective measures to try to make sure that everyone has access to decent housing, would be either a land value tax or indeed a way of shifting the ownership of land from individuals to the collective. We've done some quite interesting work on this at the New Economics Foundation. You create a People's Land Trust, and then you have a anyway, it's far too complicated to try and talk about it now, but I think what I heard say was that you know, you have to make sure that making sure that everyone has access to what they need is a very complicated matter. Mm-hmm. And that brings me back to another point that I felt worried about, and that was, you know, the simplicity of, oh well, universal basic income is great because people get the idea. Just give them some money, people love it, and that's a good idea. Well, simple ideas aren't always good ones. That's something I think we should bear in mind. And but it is a complicated business to make sure that everyone has access to what they need, and we need to be able to address that complexity up between us and see that it needs both money and services and other kinds of collective action. And that you can't use the money side of it to undermine the other side. They've got to be compatible.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a different question from Johnny Douglas. Johnny, it's about food. Are you there?
Hey, thank you. Really interesting debate. It was just to basically try and very simply understand without...
Sorry, Johnny, you're too close to your mic, I think. You're distorting a bit.
Oh, sorry. Is that any better?
That's better, yes.
Cool, yeah, it was just without kind of deviating in some of the kind of different directions we've been heading in. I just wanted to try and understand in really simple terms how food working as a universal service would work. Would meals be provided? Would kind of the ingredients be provided? How do you choose to access the food that you want? Do you get offered a certain amount of food, and if you don't want that, then that's it, that was your lot? I can't quite sort of wrap my head around it. I was just, if you could paint me a picture, that would be amazing.
Right, well, let me paint you a picture then. You start off by ensuring that everyone has got enough money to buy food, okay? And that can be quite easily understood through things like the means we use to establish a minimum income standard. But that alone will not make sure that everyone has access to nutritious food that is also sustainable. So you need a range of government measures to make sure that nutritious and sustainable food is available right across the country, that you don't have food deserts and things like that, so people can buy what they need. This is not a simple matter because there's all sorts of global dimensions and trade dimensions as well. It is a job for governments to do. So that's that bit. Then the other bit is to make sure that public institutions, and there are many of them who do provide meals both for their employees and for people who use the services that they provide, schools, hospitals, prisons and so on, do provide decent food that's of a sufficient quality and that is sustainably produced as well. and schools and other organizations, collective organizations, work with the people who they are providing services for to make sure they know what healthy diets are and what kind of food is good for them. So you've got a multifaceted program of action, if you like, to make sure that everyone has access to this one of life's essentials, which is nutritious food. So that's what it's all about. A combination of individual market power, if you like, and collective measures.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Helen G, I think you have a question or a comment that you wanted to particularly pick up with Simon. Helen, are you there? Hello, Helen?
I think she may have left.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll just read out her question. This is for Simon. Concern I have about UBI is the possibility of even greater drift to individualism and less possibility of the social and economic gains from collective action. I think Anna might be agreeing with my point as I type, but can Simon reassure me?
Yeah, well, from my point of view, of course, UBI is a collective measure, precise. I mean, that's what it is. It's a collective agreement between us all to give each other the security of a sufficient income. So at one level, I'm not quite sure of the problem. However, obviously, what it does is it gives each individual resources that they can control. You might call that individualism. But it's quite interesting. I was listening to Anna's comments and I put something in the chat because Angela Fell and I, who are both on this talk, are also involved in something called the Neighbourhood Democracy Movement. Now, we see lots of really interesting things that citizens are doing in their communities now together all over the country. In fact, often what they're doing is compensating for the inept government that we suffer from. And they're organising all sorts of brilliant things, including food networks, including kind of growing initiatives, all sorts of brilliant things. And what basic income does in regard to that is it empowers people to have free time. It empowers people to choose what they invest their time in the sense that, you know, again, the issue about the minimum income guarantee that I don't think Anna's answered, but maybe she'll answer after this, is whether it does or does not have conditionality attached. If it does, it's still got means testing. But if I say, well, I'm not going to do what you, the state, think I should be doing. Instead, I'm going to contribute to my community and there's no conditionality and I get a minimum income. And then to a degree, I'm getting something like a basic income. I'm getting that income and I'm doing whatever I want to do. So that right to do the things that you think are important, to make the contribution that you think is the best use of your skills, is an essential component of UBI. And again, and what I think the choice comes down to is an essential between, it's a brilliant book by Rutger Bregman about humankind. I don't know if people have read it, but he's really saying that fundamentally we're torn between this kind of Hobbesian sense of the individual who is so individualistic, they're going to pull society apart. So what we need is the state to basically boss people around, versus a kind of Rousseauian image that says actually people fundamentally are usually really rather nice. They can organize things individually, collectively, socially, at all sorts of levels and democratically to make good stuff happen. And I come from that kind of second camp, really. I think the evidence is that people do better when they get more freedom in their lives, when they have more security in their lives, when they're less dependent on control by other people. And this is what, in a way, this debate is really about, I think. Do we believe in each other? Do we believe in citizenship? Do we believe in equality? Or do we believe in some elite group having power and control over us for our own good?
Thank you. Anna, do you want to just quickly come in on that? And then I think we're about at the end.
That is a truly extraordinary statement by Simon. I mean, you're somebody who says you're in favor of regular public services, and yet every time you mention them, you talk about elites and bureaucrats and people bossing you about, and I mean, it's really quite scary. So I think that you really made my point that the leading advocates of UBI, and I have to assume you're one of them, really want to get rid of public services and the welfare state, and you want to leave it to everybody to have so-called freedom so they can do what they like. But actually, the way we get freedom and security is through knowing that we've got access to life's essentials, knowing that we've got, yes, enough money, but also healthcare and education and housing and transport and care and childcare. These are the things that give us the security and the independence that we need to lead our lives. And I would say one last thing that hasn't featured very much in this discussion and almost never features in discussion about UBI is that the social guarantee, as we have tried to construct it, and it's far too much for me to explain it in every detail this evening, but it is designed in order to be consistent with ecological sustainability. It's about that safe and just space for humanity. And if you're going to just give money to people to go and buy stuff in the marketplace, you don't do anything about the ecological ceiling to that safe and just space. So I have a far more benign view of the potential of collective action. And I'm well aware, since I've grown up with it, of all the flaws of the public sector, of the old welfare state and so on. I think we can learn from that experience, but we cannot afford to lose sight of the importance of acting together, pooling our resources, sharing our risks, working together so that we can all make sure we all have access to life's essentials. And you're not going to get that just through UBI. But there is a version of UBI, which you can call, if you like, a universal minimum income guarantee, that is a way of ensuring, with some conditionality, but with a generous spirit and a decent way of making sure that people can make a claim and get what they need. I haven't been able to discuss this in any length this evening, but that's a much better model. So that's where we can come together. Minimum income guarantee and universal services and a fair living wage.
I think this discussion could go on all night. I suspect we've had a very robust discussion, I would say. And I think a lot of very interesting issues have been raised. And I think this discussion will continue. There's been a lot of actually discussions carried on in the chat. So there will be a copy of this recording available so that you can actually then look at the chat if you haven't already looked at it already. I think in the chat also, Reinhard has put a notice about the next meeting of his UBI lab. I think you've already given it in there, Reinhard, so I won't mention it again here. I'd just like to say, first of all, thank you very much to both of our speakers. It's been a very long evening. You've had a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, a lot of questions, which you've dealt with both, and I think in a really interesting way. And thank you everybody else for their contribution. This debate will continue, I'm sure. And I think through debates like this, actually, it brings, things get clarified also. I found it extremely helpful. So can I just say, could we all join our hands, unmute ourselves, join our hands to give both Simon and Anna a big hand, please? Thank you very much indeed.